Hello everyone. Before we dive into today's video, I want to take a moment to thank you all for the incredible support you've shown me. As I mentioned in my previous video, I've been dealing with an invalid traffic issue, and your continued support means a lot to me. If you enjoy today's content, please consider leaving a comment below. It really helps with my issue right now. And if you'd like to take it a step further, you can join the CreepyCorner community by becoming a member and helping me prove YouTube wrong even more. Thanks again, and enjoy the stories. I worked the graveyard shift at an old prison job I found on the deep web. Last night, I saw things you wouldn't believe. So, let me start by saying, I'm not really the type to get scared easily. I don't get creeped out by ghost stories or movies. I don't jump when people yell, "Boo!" in my ear. But after last night, I don't know. Something shifted in me. I can't explain it, but I feel like I touched a part of the world that wasn't meant to be found. This all started because I needed a job. I just moved out of my parents' house, and rent is no joke. I was basically glued to job boards, scraping the bottom of the barrel just to find something that'd pay enough to cover my bills. That's how I found myself on the deep web, scrolling through listings that felt different. No standard application forms, no About Us section, and definitely no contact info. Just weirdly vague job postings with titles like maintenance specialist needed, security clearance required, or caretaker for abandoned site, overnight shift only. Then I found it. Night guard needed at decommissioned correctional facility, $30 per hour, minimal experience required. Something about it just felt right. Maybe it was the pay. Maybe it was the fact that it said minimal experience. Either way, I was sold. The posting came with a link to some sketchy site with a black screen and a little text box that just said, "Enter your info and you'll be contacted if accepted." So, without thinking much, I typed in my name, my email, and my phone number. The screen blinked and then it just said, "Accepted. Shift begins tomorrow, 10 p.m. Sharp." That's it. No orientation, no instructions, just a time and an address. The next day, I showed up at this crumbling, half-forsaken prison complex just outside of town. Honestly, it looked more like a set from a horror movie than a place anyone would work. The building itself was monstrous, 4 stories high with broken windows and rusted bars on everyone. The whole place smelled like mildew and old metal. There was no one around when I arrived, just a laminated sheet taped to the door that said, "Clock in with the device inside. Follow the instructions." Inside, it was worse. The halls were dark except for a few flickering lights, and every sound echoed like it was coming from miles away. The walls were covered in peeling paint and stains that had seeped in over who knows how many decades. I'd heard that when this prison was operational, it was for special cases. They never explained what that meant, but the rumors said it held some seriously disturbed people. The kind of people you wouldn't want even breathing in your direction. Just as I was starting to wonder if this was a huge mistake, I saw the device mentioned in the instructions, a cheap, outdated tablet lying on a folding table near the main entrance. The screen lit up as soon as I picked it up, and a message popped up. "Welcome. You are to remain in the central hall for the duration of your shift. Do not wander into cell blocks. Report any disturbances." There was a little "Acknowledge" button underneath, so I tapped it, and it changed to a clock counting down from 8 hours. Easy enough, I thought. but something felt off. The place was dead silent, like no one had even breathed in here for years. Still, I shrugged it off, found a rickety chair, and settled in to watch the hours tick down on the tablet. The first few hours were uneventful. I scrolled through my phone, played some games, watched a couple of YouTube videos, just the usual stuff you do to kill time. But around 1 a.m., things started to get weird. I heard this faint sound, like metal dragging against concrete, somewhere deep in the building. It was distant, almost like it was coming from behind thick walls, but it was definitely there. My mind instantly went to rats or something, which made sense in a place like this. Still, it gave me the creeps. But then, around 2:30, I started hearing something else. It was like whispering, soft and low, but impossible to make out. It almost sounded like chanting. I couldn't pin it down, but every few minutes, I'd catch these faint voices. By now, I was trying to convince myself it was the wind whistling through broken windows, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded too deliberate, like there were people in another room whispering to each other. After a while, the whispering stopped, and I started to relax again. But then the lights started to flicker. Now, I know this is an old place, and the wiring's probably trash, but this was different. The flickering was rhythmic, almost like it was pulsing in time with a heartbeat. I could feel it vibrating through the chair, up my spine. It was weirdly unsettling, like the whole building was alive. I checked the tablet to see if there was anything in the instructions about the lights, but the screen was blank. Just the countdown clock, ticking down the minutes until my shift ended. I was about halfway through the shift at this point, and thinking about just leaving, but the pay was too good. I wasn't about to walk away from $30 an hour because I got spooked. Then, I saw something that made me freeze. About 50 feet down the hall, a shadow passed under one of the flickering lights. It was fast, like someone darting past, but it was definitely a person. I strained my eyes, trying to see if there was anyone there, but the light above me dimmed, and suddenly everything went pitch black. Just as I was about to lose it, the light snapped back on, and the hallway was empty. No footsteps, no sound, nothing. I sat there, staring at the spot where I'd seen the shadow, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. It's just nerves, I told myself. It's just an old building with bad wiring and a few rats. But then, just as I was convincing myself to calm down, I heard a door creak open. This time, it was closer. Way closer. And the countdown timer? It reset to 8 hours. I stared at the tablet, not believing my eyes. The timer had reset, and the number 8000 blinked like it was mocking me. I swiped the screen, tapped at it, trying to make it go back to where it was, but nothing worked. The clock just kept counting down from 8 hours, as if I hadn't already been there for half the night. I told myself it was probably a glitch. After all, this tablet looked like it was ancient tech, maybe a leftover from the prison's old security system. Yeah, I thought, just a glitch. Then I heard the door again. This time, it sounded even closer. I tried to pinpoint which direction it came from, but in this place, sounds seemed to come from everywhere. It was like the building itself was shifting and creaking, echoing the noises back at me in distorted ways. I stood up, feeling the air around me thicken, like the weight of the whole prison was pressing down. The hallway in front of me was barely lit, just enough to show where the walls met the floor. Beyond that, it was all shadows. I felt my gut twist, telling me to stay put, to wait it out. But then I saw it again, A dark shape, moving in the far end of the hall, like a person half hidden in the shadows. The thing was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for a normal person. It wasn't running or walking. It was just standing there, like it was waiting. I blinked, and it was gone. My brain scrambled to make sense of it. Maybe it was just the lights playing tricks on me, or maybe I'd just been sitting too long. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. I pulled it out, expecting some random notification or spam text, but there was nothing on the screen. No missed calls, no messages, just the time, 2:47 a.m. And then I heard my phone ring, except it wasn't ringing in my hand. I heard the sound of my ringtone echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. I don't know what came over me, but something in me snapped. I was alone, right? There was no one else here, and I was supposed to stay in the central hall. But hearing my phone ringing from down the hall, there was no way I was letting that slide. I mean, if someone else was in here, I had to know who. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself as I walked forward, my steps echoing down the long, empty corridor. The air was thick with this stale, metallic smell, like blood and rust. I could feel it stick to my skin, cold and damp. As I moved, my footsteps grew louder, bouncing back at me from every direction, and that's when I realized it wasn't just my footsteps I was hearing. There was another set, slightly out of sync with mine, coming from somewhere behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. So did the footsteps. I wanted to turn around, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I just stood there, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. After a few seconds, I forced myself to look back. The hallway behind me was empty, nothing but shadows. But the silence was worse than the footsteps. It felt like something was watching, something just out of sight, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Then the ringing started again, my ringtone, blaring from somewhere down the hall. I kept walking, trying to ignore the way my shadow stretched out in front of me, making me feel like I was being pulled into the darkness. The ringing was getting louder, coming from behind a heavy iron door marked Infirmary. The paint on the door was chipped and faded, with scratch marks crisscrossing its surface. It looked like someone had tried to claw their way out. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn around, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was freezing. It was empty, just rows of old medical beds with restraints dangling from the sides. The walls were covered in dark stains, maybe mold, maybe something worse. But the smell, it was thick, like decay and antiseptic, mixing into this awful stench that made my eyes water. And in the middle of the room, right on the floor, was my phone. I picked it up, but the screen was still blank. The time showed 2:47 a.m., the same time it had displayed before. But the weirdest part, the battery icon was at 47%, the same percentage as it had been when I left my apartment earlier that night. It was like time hadn't passed at all, but I knew I'd been there for hours. I felt this cold, creeping fear worming its way up my spine. I wanted to leave, but the tablet's warning came back to me. Report any disturbances. I grabbed the tablet from my pocket, tapped open the screen, and typed, "Something is wrong. There's someone or something in here. I need help." For a second, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered, and a message appeared. "You are not alone. Stay calm. Remain in the central hall." Right then, the lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, I saw something. A figure standing just behind me, reflected in the glass screen of the tablet. Its face, or what I could see of it, was pale, with eyes that seemed too wide, too hollow. It had no mouth, no nose, just those eyes, staring straight at me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty infirmary, the beds, and the shadows. I backed out of the room, my legs shaking as I tried to keep my breathing steady. The hallway felt darker now, like the walls were closing in. I started walking back to the central hall, my eyes darting around, every nerve in my body on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that any second, something was going to grab me from the darkness. When I finally reached the hall, I sat back down, clutching the tablet like it was some kind of shield. The timer was still ticking down from 8 hours, as if none of what I'd just gone through had even mattered. Just as I was starting to catch my breath, I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone, and this time there was a message. It was from a number I didn't recognize. The message just said, "Don't move. It's right behind you." My hands went numb. I stared at the message, reading it over and over, as if it would somehow change. "Don't move. It's right behind you." I didn't dare turn around. I could feel a chill prickling the back of my neck, like someone, or something, was close enough to touch me. The air felt thick, and my breathing was the only sound in the whole place. Slowly, I forced myself to look down at the tablet, hoping for some kind of instruction, maybe even a glitch that would let me clock out early. But the screen was blank, just that cold countdown, ticking away the hours, taunting me with every second. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I turned around as slowly as I could manage, my muscles tense, expecting, well, I didn't even know what to expect. But behind me, there was only darkness stretching down the long, empty hallway. Nothing. I let out a shaky breath, but my nerves were still shot. My phone buzzed again, and I nearly dropped it. Another message from the same unknown number. This time, it just said, "I warned you." I whipped around again, but still, nothing. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. But then I heard something faint, like whispering, coming from the end of the hallway, where the shadows were thickest. It was a low murmur, words too jumbled and soft to understand. And then, as if they were suddenly on a loop, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. I started walking backward, keeping my eyes fixed on the darkness, half expecting something to lunge out at me. My heart pounded as I glanced at the tablet, hoping for any update, anything to explain what was going on. But instead, the tablet showed a new message, scrolling across the screen. "Do not acknowledge the voices." The tablet screen flickered, and I could swear I heard a faint hiss coming from it, like static mixed with something alive. I was gripping the tablet so tightly that my fingers started to cramp. I kept my eyes down, refusing to look back into the darkness, even as the whispers grew louder, now laced with what sounded like laughter, soft and taunting, like it was daring me to come closer. I glanced around the central hall, desperately looking for any sign of an exit. But it wasn't just a hall anymore. The shadows were somehow longer, stretching up the walls like they had minds of their own. I could barely see the walls, as if the room itself was shrinking, pressing me closer to the darkness. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the hall. They didn't sound like mine, or even human. They were too heavy, dragging slightly, each step sending this low, shivering vibration through the floor. The whisper stopped abruptly, and in that silence, all I could hear were those dragging footsteps getting closer. I gripped the tablet tighter, my knuckles white, as the footsteps continued, echoing louder with each step. The timer was still ticking down, showing 7:34:22, moving at an agonizingly slow pace. My only comfort was the thin light from the screen, casting a faint glow over my shaking hands. Then, in the glow of the tablet, I saw something strange. Scratches on the floor near my feet, faint but deep, as if someone had dragged sharp nails across the concrete. I hadn't noticed them before, but they looked fresh, like they'd been made just minutes ago. Following the scratch marks, I saw that they led toward the hall where the footsteps were coming from, carving out a jagged line in the floor that seemed to twist and turn, leading back to the darkness. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and started to back up, keeping my eyes on that hallway. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. I told myself to keep it together, to stay calm, but my mind was screaming that something was wrong, that I needed to get out, even if it meant leaving without the pay. Then the tablet buzzed in my hand, and a new message appeared, one that made my blood run cold. Do not turn around. I froze, staring at the message. I could feel something behind me, that prickling sensation of being watched, but heavier, like whatever was there wasn't just looking at me. It was studying me, waiting for me to make a move. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I felt a warm breath against my neck. My whole body locked up. I didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to stay still, staring down at the tablet. The screen flickered again, and another message scrolled across. You're breaking the rules. The lights flickered, and for a split second, I saw a shadow over my shoulder in the tablet's reflection. It was tall, almost touching the ceiling, with elongated arms hanging at its sides, fingers ending in sharp, claw-like points. And its face, if you could even call it that, was blank, just a pale surface with dark, hollow spots where eyes should be, staring back at me through the reflection. The lights blinked back on, and the shadow was gone, but the warm breath was still there, chilling my skin. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted, ignoring every warning, every rule from the tablet. I sprinted down the hallway, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away. As I ran, the whispers started up again, louder, filling the hall with that same taunting laughter, overlapping voices that grew louder with each step. Then the footsteps started again, pounding down the hall, gaining on me. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them, faster, closer, echoing like there was more than one set, like an entire crowd was running after me. I turned a corner and found myself in a narrow hallway, lined with old iron-barred cells. The doors were wide open, swinging slightly, creaking as they moved. The lights above were dim, flickering just enough to show me the row of cells disappearing into darkness. I ran down the row, looking for anything that could hide me, or better yet, an exit. But the farther I went, the more the hallway stretched on, twisting and turning like a maze. Finally, I stumbled into a dead end. A locked gate stood in front of me, the lock old and rusted. I yanked at it, desperate, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the footsteps were getting closer, now mingling with the sound of something scraping along the walls. Then, just as I was about to give up, the tablet buzzed again. I glanced down, and a new message appeared. Enter the cell on your left. Do not close your eyes. I didn't have a choice. I ducked into the cell, pressing myself against the cold wall, and tried to control my breathing. The footsteps grew louder, right outside the cell, and I could see a shadow pass by the bars, elongated and twisted, like whoever, or whatever, was out there was stretching and distorting. I held my breath, keeping my eyes wide open, terrified that if I blinked, something would reach through the bars and pull me out. The shadow stopped, lingering just outside, as if it knew I was there. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, heavy and slow, almost like it was savoring the fear in the air. Finally, the shadow moved on, and the footsteps faded into the distance. I stayed there, pressed against the wall, too scared to move, barely daring to breathe. Then the tablet buzzed one last time. I looked down, my heart pounding, and read the new message. Your shift is far from over. The timer reset again. I stood in the cell, the cold seeping through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. My hand shook as I clutched the tablet, watching the timer flicker back to 8 hours. There was no way out of this. Every time I got closer to morning, the clock would just reset. The walls felt like they were closing in, like they were watching me, taunting me, trapping me here for eternity. The footsteps had faded, but I didn't trust the silence. I forced myself to breathe, listening for any hint of movement, anything that would signal if that thing was still nearby. But the hallway outside the cell was dead silent. Just as I was about to let myself believe it had left, the tablet buzzed again. I felt my stomach drop as I looked down at the screen. Move to the central hall. Do not enter the infirmary. The infirmary. That room was the last place I wanted to be. The image of those restraints dangling from the beds, those scratches on the door. It felt like a cage waiting to snap shut. And yet, as I stepped out of the cell and started making my way back, I could see it up ahead, the door slightly ajar, like it was inviting me in. My footsteps echoed as I moved through the maze of cells, each one empty, but filled with a suffocating kind of dread. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting that shadowy figure to reappear, lurking just out of reach. Every so often, I catch a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, just a blur, disappearing as soon as I turned to look. It was like the prison was alive, bending reality, twisting the hallways into something endless. Finally, I reached the central hall. I breathed a small sigh of relief, but that didn't last long. The tablet buzzed in my hand, another message flashing across the screen. Proceed to the control room. Access restricted. Control room? I hadn't seen anything that even resembled one since I got here. But the word restricted made my blood run cold. Whatever was happening in this prison, whatever was lurking in the shadows, the control room was clearly part of it. Maybe it was even watching me, every move I made. I took a deep breath and started walking. The control room, if I could find it, might have answers, directions twisted, hallways seeming to double back on themselves. But eventually, I spotted a door with faded paint that read, Control. My fingers felt numb as I reached for the handle. It turned easily, and I stepped inside, half expecting alarms or some nightmarish figure to leap out at me. The room was small, cramped, filled with outdated monitors and control panels covered in dust. It looked like no one had set foot in here for years, yet the screens were lit, static flickering over their cracked surfaces. In the center of the desk was a single red button labeled Override. Before I could think twice, the tablet buzzed again. Do not press the button. I looked at the button, then back at the tablet. The messages had been clear up to this point, warning me to follow instructions, but something in me itched to press it. I had been following rules, watching clocks reset, trapped in an endless loop of horrors. Maybe this button was the way out. Ignoring the warning, I reached out and pressed it. At first, nothing happened. I stood there, waiting, my breath catching in my throat. Then, one by one, the screens flickered and came to life, showing views from cameras all around the prison, hallways, cells, even the infirmary. I could see everything, every dark corner, every shadowed cell. And that's when I saw it. In one of the hallways near the infirmary, something was moving. It was that figure again, the one with 2 long limbs, gliding through the hall. But this time, I could see it clearly. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, pale and slick, like it had been pulled from something much larger and sewn onto a human form. It moved unnaturally, jerking and twisting as it walked, its hollow eyes fixed straight ahead. Then, as if it could sense me watching, it stopped and turned, staring directly at the camera. Its eyes, empty and dark, seemed to bore into me, as though it knew exactly where I was, hiding in the control room. The thing tilted its head slowly, like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, without warning, it started moving towards the control room. I felt panic rising, the walls seeming to press in tighter, the air growing colder. I checked the screen again, but the figure was gone. I switched between cameras, but it was nowhere to be seen. Just empty hallways, filled with shadows that seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. The tablet buzzed again, and I looked down, my heart pounding. "You were warned." I didn't have time to think. I could hear footsteps outside the control room door. That same dragging sound, only now it was slower, more deliberate, like it was savoring each step. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing, and looked around for anything I could use to defend myself. But the room was empty except for the old monitors and a few broken chairs. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and I held my breath, listening as something scratched at the wood, slow and rhythmic. Then the handle started to turn, the door creaking open inch by inch. I backed up until I hit the far wall, my eyes glued to the door as it swung open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. But there was nothing there, just the empty hall, silent and still. I exhaled, relief flooding through me. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it was just playing with me. But as I took a step forward, the lights in the control room flickered, and in the brief flashes of light, I saw it standing right inside the doorway. Tall, hunched, its hollow eyes staring straight at me, its mouth stretched into a twisted grin, a gaping dark hole filled with something writhing just beneath the surface. It took a step toward me, and the air turned icy, my breath visible in the faint light. My whole body felt frozen, locked in place as it reached out a long skeletal hand, its fingers ending in sharp, bony points. Then the tablet buzzed one last time. I forced myself to look down, and the message on the screen was simple: "Run." I didn't think twice. I darted past it, feeling the cold brush of its hand grazing my arm as I ran down the hallway. I could hear it behind me, those footsteps pounding, faster now, echoing through the building as I sprinted down one twisting hall after another, my vision blurring as panic took over. The hallway seemed endless, twisting and looping back on itself, each turn leading to another dark corridor. I didn't know where I was going. I was just running, hoping that somehow I'd find a way out. And then, Just as I felt my lungs burning, ready to give up, I saw the main entrance up ahead, the door slightly ajar. I pushed myself harder, sprinting toward it, my pulse pounding in my ears. But just as I reached the door, it slammed shut. I pounded on it, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. I turned around, and there it was, standing at the end of the hall, its mouth twisted into that horrifying grin. It started moving toward me, slow and deliberate, its eyes locked onto mine, like it knew I was trapped. Then I noticed something on the wall next to me, a small emergency exit sign with an arrow pointing down a side hall. Without a second thought, I sprinted toward it, the creature following, its footsteps echoing louder and louder as I ran. Finally, I found myself in front of a narrow metal door with a rusted lock. I yanked on it, feeling the metal bite into my fingers, but it wouldn't give. And then the tablet buzzed again, and the final message appeared on the screen. "Time's up." The lights went out, and everything plunged into darkness. I stood there in the pitch black, my heart racing so loud it was the only sound I could hear. The heavy silence wrapped around me like a shroud, and I could feel that thing getting closer, its presence pressing in from the darkness. My hands were clenched around the useless tablet, the screen now completely dead, leaving me with nothing but an empty reflection of my own terrified face. I tried to push back the panic, to think of something, anything, that could get me out of this. But the metal door behind me was locked tight, and the main entrance was sealed. The hallway stretched on in both directions, disappearing into darkness, offering no escape. Then faintly, I heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it wasn't just the low murmur I'd heard before. It was closer, louder, and I could make out words fractured and eerie, echoing down the hall. "You don't belong here." The voices overlapped, hundreds of them, each one dripping with malice, as if the walls themselves were speaking. And then the footsteps returned, heavy, dragging, echoing down the hall with an unsteady rhythm that made my skin crawl. I pressed myself against the cold metal of the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The footsteps grew louder, and that's when I realized they weren't coming from a single direction anymore. They were coming from everywhere. I felt trapped, surrounded, as if the whole prison had come alive, watching, waiting, savoring my fear. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps closed in, my eyes darting around the shadows. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was losing it from exhaustion and panic. But the whispers were too clear, the footsteps too real, too close. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a sharp, cold touch graze my arm. I flinched, jerking away, but there was no one there, just empty air. But it was enough to get me moving. I took off down the hall, my feet pounding against the concrete as I ran blindly through the darkness. The whispers followed me, hissing, laughing, each one louder than the last, like a crowd of unseen figures closing in around me. Every step I took, I felt that cold touch again, brushing against my shoulders, my neck, like they were reaching out from the walls themselves. Finally, I turned a corner and saw something ahead, faint light spilling out from under a door at the end of the hall. It was the only thing breaking through the shadows, a sliver of hope in the pitch-black nightmare. I sprinted toward it, desperation pushing me forward, and reached out for the handle, yanking it open. Inside was an old office, cluttered with dusty filing cabinets and a single flickering lamp on a desk. The air was stale and thick, but at least it was bright enough that I could see. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to catch my breath. The whispers faded, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt a small sense of relief. I took a few deep breaths, calming my nerves, and looked around the room. Papers were scattered across the desk, some of them so old the ink had faded, but one sheet caught my eye. It was newer than the others, a clean sheet of paper with something scrawled in thick, dark ink. "There's no way out." I felt my stomach drop. It was like the words were staring back at me, confirming the truth I'd been trying to deny. I was trapped here, and whatever was in this prison wasn't going to let me leave. Then, I noticed something else on the desk, a small dusty mirror. At first, it seemed like just another old relic in a room full of forgotten junk. But as I looked closer, I saw movement. Not my own reflection, but something behind me. A shadow, standing just over my shoulder, watching me through the mirror's glass. I turned slowly, my body numb with fear, but there was nothing there. Just the empty office, silent and still. I looked back at the mirror, my hands shaking, and that's when I saw it. The shadow was still there, its hollow eyes staring straight at me through the reflection, as if it were trapped in the glass, waiting for me to turn my back. I stumbled back from the desk, nearly tripping over my own feet, and that's when I felt the cold air shift. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath turned to mist, and I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone. The lights flickered, and the shadow stepped out from the mirror, slipping through the glass as if it were stepping out of water. It moved slowly, deliberately, stretching its two long limbs as it emerged, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, the twisted grin spreading across its face. It took a step forward, and I could feel the air grow colder, each step sucking the warmth from the room. I backed up, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows thickening, pressing me closer to the creature. I could barely move, barely breathe, as it leaned in, its face inches from mine, its hollow eyes filled with something dark, endless, and hungry. Then it spoke. Its voice was low, layered, like 100 voices speaking in unison. "Your shift is over." And with those words, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the concrete floor of the prison's entrance, the morning light streaming through the cracked windows. I blinked, disoriented, as I pushed myself up, my body aching, my mind struggling to remember how I'd ended up here. The last thing I remembered was that creature, those hollow eyes, that twisted grin. I looked around, but the prison was empty, silent, nothing but dust and decaying walls. The tablet was gone, and my phone was lying beside me, the screen cracked, but still working. I checked the time. It was 8 a.m., right when my shift was supposed to end. It was as if nothing had happened, like the whole night had been some twisted hallucination. But as I got to my feet, I felt something in my pocket, a single, crumpled piece of paper. I pulled it out, my hand shaking as I unfolded it. There was a message scrawled in dark ink, the same handwriting I'd seen on that sheet, in the office. "You'll be back." I bolted out of that prison, not looking back, not daring to slow down until I was safely in my car. I drove away, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to return. But even now, I can still feel it, that cold, creeping presence, lingering just out of sight. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the whispers, faint and distant, like they're calling me back. I found a government chat room on the dark web discussing experiments in my town. I started seeing black van going around our town. I don't know how else to start this story, except by saying I'm not usually the kind of person who goes poking around on the dark web. I'd heard all the creepy stories, sure, the hacker tales, the illegal trade stuff, all that, but it never really felt real to me. Until a couple of months ago, I'd never even downloaded Tor, and now I wish I hadn't, because what I found wasn't some conspiracy theory or overblown urban legend. It was real. And now, well, I'll get to that. I'm not even sure why I did it in the first place. Maybe I was just bored. Maybe I wanted to see if there was any truth to the crazy stories my friends told at parties. Anyway, one night I decided to give it a shot, telling myself it was just for a laugh. I followed some basic how-to guide on Reddit, got Tor up and running, and before I knew it, I was deep down a rabbit hole of hidden forums and weird sites. Now, here's where it gets interesting. I was clicking through different forums, most of them looking like outdated websites from the early 2000s. You know, super basic designs, like just walls of text and way too many links. Nothing really seemed sketchy at first. It was actually kind of boring, until I found this one link with no description, just a long string of random letters and numbers. I clicked on it, not expecting much. The page loaded and it was almost entirely blank. There was no header, no footer, nothing but a chat room window in the middle of the page with a few active users in the corner. But here's the thing. There were no usernames, just user 1, user 2, user 3, and so on. All of them were just typing short messages as if they were in the middle of a serious conversation. I didn't know what was happening, but something felt wrong. The first message I saw was from user 2, and it said, "We'll need more test subjects from the towns along Route 22. They're statistically less likely to be noticed missing." I remember sitting there, blinking at the screen, trying to process what I'd just read. More test subjects? It felt like I'd stumbled into some hidden government operation, or maybe some twisted roleplay game. But then another user replied, "Make sure the vans stay unmarked. We don't want anyone in my town's name getting curious. They're already on edge after the last incident." The last incident? My stomach dropped a little. I live in a quiet town. Nothing ever happens here. A couple of break-ins every now and then, but nothing that would make anyone on edge. But the way they were talking, it sounded like something big had happened that I didn't know about. I tried to tell myself it was just some sick joke, like these guys were just screwing around on the dark web to mess with anyone who happened to stumble into their chat. But then I kept reading. User 5 typed, "Containment is key. The dosage on subject 41 was too high. We need to adjust before the next trial." My heart started racing. This didn't feel like a joke anymore. Subject 41? Containment. They were talking about people. Real people. And these people were apparently from my town. At this point, I was glued to the screen, reading every message as it appeared, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. I don't know why I didn't just click away or close my laptop, but there was this sick curiosity that kept me rooted to the spot. User 3 wrote, "Increase patrols in my town's name. Someone reported a black van last week. We can't afford any slips now that we're this close." A black van? I'd seen a black van parked by the gas station about a week ago, just sitting there for hours. I didn't think much of it at the time. figured it was just someone from out of town. But reading this, it started clicking into place, and I didn't like where my thoughts were going. Then User 1, who I guessed was sort of the leader, typed, "The experiment has to go as planned. No deviations, no witnesses. If anyone asks, it's a government surveillance operation. Nothing more." That was enough for me. I closed the window, shut down Tor, and slammed my laptop shut like it was radioactive. I was breathing hard, feeling like I'd just sprinted up a flight of stairs. But here's the thing, I couldn't shake it off. I kept thinking about that black van. I'd seen it again a couple of days ago, parked near the high school this time. The more I thought about it, the more it bugged me. I mean, my town isn't exactly a hotspot for surveillance. The idea that the government would care about some tiny place like this, it didn't add up. But what those people in the chat room were talking about, test subjects, dosages, containment, it sounded like some horror movie stuff. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those messages flash in my head. No witnesses. Containment. Experiment. I didn't know what any of it meant, but I had this horrible feeling that something was about to happen. And then the next day, I saw the van again. That next morning, I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. But you know how sometimes you get that gut feeling that something isn't right, no matter how much you try to brush it off. That's exactly what it was like. I went to work, tried to focus on the usual stuff, told myself I was overreacting, but all day it felt like someone was watching me, like a set of eyes was just drilling into my back. The van was still there, parked a little further down the street, near the park this time. Black, no license plate, not a single logo or marking, just parked there, dead silent. I tried to ignore it, but every time I glanced over, I felt this strange chill, like it wasn't just a vehicle, you know, like it was something alive, waiting for what, I didn't know, but it was waiting. Things got even weirder that evening. I was walking home, and just before I turned down my street, I saw another van, a different one this time, same unmarked black, same blank windows. It was parked at the edge of my block, just sitting there with the lights off. The whole thing felt wrong. My town's not big. You start noticing when strange vehicles hang around more than once. I tried to just walk past, act normal, but my skin was crawling. And then, as I got to my driveway, I noticed something else. The street was dead quiet. Now, I know that sounds like nothing, but usually there's some noise. Kids playing, dogs barking, people mowing their lawns. But that evening, it was like everyone in my neighborhood had vanished. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was alone. It felt like the whole street was holding its breath. When I finally got inside, I locked the door, double-checked all the windows, and sat in my living room, trying to calm myself down. I must have stared out the window for an hour, waiting to see if the van would drive by again. But it didn't. Just that eerie silence, hanging over everything. That night, I kept thinking about the chat room. No witnesses. Containment. We need more test subjects. Every time I closed my eyes, those words seemed to echo louder, like they were being whispered right into my ear. My head was spinning with questions, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I needed answers. The only problem was, I had no idea how to get them. And then, around midnight, I heard something outside. I can't explain it, but there was this heavy, dragging sound, like something was being pulled down the street. I got out of bed, barely breathing, and crept to my window. lifting the curtain just enough to peek out. And there it was again, that black van, parked right under the streetlight, across from my house. Only this time, there was a man standing next to it, looking right at my house. I ducked back, heart pounding, hoping he hadn't seen me. But then I heard that dragging noise again. I risked another glance and felt my stomach drop. The guy was dragging something out of the back of the van. It was hard to make out, but it looked human, not moving. Just a dark shape slumped over his shoulder as he dragged it onto the sidewalk. My hands were shaking. I wanted to call the cops, but I was frozen in place. I mean, what would I even say? Hey, there's some creepy guy pulling a body out of his van outside my house. It sounded insane, but I couldn't look away. He pulled the figure to the edge of the street, then crouched down, looking around like he was checking if anyone was watching. I shrank back, holding my breath. After a few moments, I heard the van door slam shut, and the engine rumbled to life. The van pulled away, leaving the figure on the sidewalk, just lying there, motionless. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, waiting for something to happen. Finally, I worked up the nerve to go outside, my phone clutched tight in my hand. Every step felt like it took an eternity, my heart thudding so loud it drowned out everything else. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just a pile of garbage bags or something that fell out of the van. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman, lying on her side, eyes half open, barely conscious. Are you okay? I whispered, my voice coming out all shaky. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't respond. Her skin was pearl, almost gray, and she looked empty, like the life had been drained out of her. I knelt down, trying to see if she was hurt, but then I noticed something strange. She had this weird scar on her neck, like a small puncture mark, almost like an injection site. I started backing away, feeling my stomach twist. I didn't know what I was seeing, but it felt wrong, like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. I glanced around, suddenly terrified that the van might come back, that someone was still watching me, and that's when I saw it, just down the road. Another black van parked in the shadows, with its headlights off. I bolted back to my house, locking the door behind me and flipping off all the lights. I didn't sleep that night. Every little noise had me jumping, convinced they were coming back for me, that I'd seen too much. And that woman, I couldn't get the image out of my head. Her pale face, those empty eyes, that puncture mark on her neck. The next morning, I went outside, half expecting to see her still lying there on the sidewalk. But she was gone. No sign of her. No sign that anyone had even been there. It was like it had never happened, but I knew what I saw. The next morning, I felt like a ghost. I hadn't slept a wink, and every shadow, every slight movement outside my window made me jump. I tried telling myself it was all in my head, that maybe I dreamed the whole thing, that it was just some twisted trick of my exhausted mind. But that puncture mark on her neck, that lifeless look in her eyes, I couldn't just forget it. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see that van, parked in the same spot, waiting, but the street was empty. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, about what I'd seen, but I had no idea how to explain it without sounding insane. I mean, what was I supposed to say? I saw some guy dump an almost dead woman on the sidewalk in front of my house. Yeah, right. By the time evening rolled around, I was ready to put the whole thing behind me. I told myself I'd overreacted, that it was just some freaky coincidence. Maybe the woman had just been sick or something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I was sitting on my couch, half watching TV, when my phone buzzed. I picked it up, and my heart stopped. It was an unknown number, no caller ID. I wouldn't normally answer, but something about it felt different, like I needed to know who was on the other end. So I answered, "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, just this faint static, like someone was there, listening, but wasn't saying anything. I almost hung up, but then I heard it, a low mechanical voice, distorted, almost like it was coming from some cheap text-to-speech program. "You're in danger. Do not speak about what you've seen." I froze, my phone slipping in my hand. I opened my mouth to say something, but the line went dead. I just sat there, staring at my phone, my heart racing. Who the hell was that? How did they know I'd seen anything? It felt like some sick joke, but the fear in my gut told me it was anything but. I was shaking. I didn't know if I should call the cops or just lock myself in my room. My hands were slick with sweat, and I felt like I was coming unglued. I didn't know who I was dealing with, but I knew one thing. Whoever they were, they weren't messing around. Over the next few days, the paranoia started to eat away at me. I kept seeing that black van, parked in different spots around town, just lurking. Sometimes it would be down the block from my place. Other times it was outside the grocery store, or near the gas station where I filled up. Always there, just within sight, watching. One afternoon, I decided to test it. I left my house, trying to act casual, and walked down to the convenience store, glancing around every few seconds to see if I was being followed. Sure enough, as I turned the corner, I saw the van creeping along, a couple of blocks behind me. I walked faster, trying to shake them, but every time I turned around, they were still there, keeping their distance, but making it very clear they weren't going anywhere. I ducked into the store, heart pounding, and pretended to browse the shelves, all while watching them through the window. I noticed the guy behind the counter, this older guy who'd worked there forever, looking at me with a curious expression. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice a little rough, but kind. I hesitated. I knew it sounded crazy, but I was desperate. "That black van out there, have you seen it before?" He gave me this long, hard look, and I could tell he was sizing me up. Then, to my surprise, he nodded, glancing out the window. "Yeah, I've seen it. Seen it a few times, actually. They're around more often than they should be." I felt a rush of relief. At least I wasn't the only one who'd noticed it. "Do you know who they are?" He hesitated, looking around like he was checking if anyone else was listening. Finally, he leaned in close and said, "Listen, I don't know who they are, but I know they're bad news. Ever since they showed up, strange things have been happening. People going missing, weird noises at night. Ain't right." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Missing people. I hadn't heard anything about that. But then again, it's not like I paid attention to every local news story. And that woman, had she been one of the missing? Before I could ask him more, he shook his head and turned back to his work, like he'd already said too much. I left the store feeling worse than before. My mind was racing with questions, and every time I thought I had something figured out, a new twist would throw me off. Why was the van following me? What was with the injection marks? And most of all, what the hell were they doing in my town? That night, I decided to do some digging. I pulled out my laptop and went back on the dark web, hoping maybe I could find that chat room again. I know, it was a stupid idea, but I felt like I had no choice. I needed answers. After an hour of searching, I finally found the link. The chat room was still active, but this time there were more people, new usernames, new messages flooding in. I tried to catch up, scrolling back to see what I'd missed. That's when I saw it, buried among all the messages. Subject 47 is showing signs of awareness. Surveillance required. A chill ran down my spine. Awareness. Were they talking about me? I scrolled further, trying to make sense of the fragmented messages, my heart pounding with each line. Then, another message popped up, sent just moments before I logged on. Containment measures for my town's name may need to escalate. The subject is becoming a liability. It felt like my whole body went cold. I was the subject they were talking about. They knew I'd seen them. They knew I was onto them. And from the sound of it, they were planning something I had no control over. And then, one last message flashed on the screen, right before the chat room went silent. If the subject tries to expose us, execute Protocol X. I didn't know what Protocol X was, but I didn't want to find out. My fingers were shaking as I closed the laptop, barely able to breathe. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, every creak and groan of the house setting my nerves on edge. I kept the lights off, trying to make myself as invisible as possible. My laptop shoved under my bed, as if that alone would erase what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew I couldn't undo it. They knew I was watching. They knew I was aware. And now, I was certain they were coming for me. Around 3 a.m, I heard it. A low hum, like an engine idling just outside. My heart dropped. I crawled to my window, carefully pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek through. There it was, another black van, parked right across the street, headlights off, engine rumbling like a predator lying in wait. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal. I considered calling someone, my friends, maybe the cops, but I knew that wouldn't do any good. Whatever this was, it was bigger than anything the local authorities could handle. Besides, they probably think I was crazy. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I waited. An hour later, the van was still there, unmoving. It was like they were waiting for me to make the first move. I tried to think through my options, weighing the chances of sneaking out the back, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming up my driveway. I scrambled back from the window, my heart hammering. Whoever it was, they were getting closer, each step louder than the last. I could see their shadow moving across the front of my house, long and dark, stretching out under the streetlight. I held my breath, praying they'd pass by, that maybe they were just checking the perimeter. But then I heard a soft tap on the window, like someone testing the glass. I froze, every muscle in my body locked up, waiting. I could feel them on the other side, waiting just as silently. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, and for a moment, it was like a standoff, each of us waiting to see who would make the first move. And then, I heard it, the faint sound of someone trying the door handle. I wanted to scream, but I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing myself to stay silent. They rattled the handle a few more times, but thankfully, I'd locked it. There was a moment of silence, and then a quiet clicking sound, like they were trying to pick the lock. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed the only person I could think of who might believe me. Jake, an old friend of mine, who'd always been into conspiracy theories and weird government stuff. The phone rang once, twice, and then he picked up, sounding groggy and irritated. "Dude, it's like 4 in the morning. "Jake," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "They're here. They're trying to get in." There was a pause, then his voice got deadly serious. "Wait. Who? Who's there?" "The black van people. The ones I told you about." I was whispering so quietly I could barely hear myself, but I didn't want to risk them hearing me. "They know I've been watching them. They're outside my house right now." Jake was silent for a moment, and I could almost feel him processing what I'd just said. "All right, listen to me. Do you have a back door?" "Yes, but..." "Then get out. Go now. I don't care where you go. Just don't stay there. And turn off your phone's location services in case they're tracking you." I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone, but I knew he was right. I grabbed a jacket, shoved my phone in my pocket, and crept toward the back door as quietly as I could. The front door rattled again, and I heard someone mutter something low and harsh, like they were getting frustrated. I slipped out the back, doing my best to keep my footsteps light, and made a break for it. I didn't stop running until I reached the end of the block, where I hid behind a row of trash cans, trying to catch my breath. I glanced back, half expecting to see the van barreling after me, but the street was empty. For a second, I let myself hope that maybe I'd managed to lose them, and then, as I looked around, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Another black van was parked at the other end of the street, headlights off, but I could see a shadowy figure sitting behind the wheel, watching me. I didn't even think. I just ran. I ducked through alleyways, cut across people's yards, trying to put as much distance between me and the van as possible. I ended up at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, where I finally stopped to catch my breath. I sat in a booth near the back, shaking and exhausted, my mind racing with 100 different questions. I knew I couldn't go home. Whatever Protocol X was, it was happening, and I had no doubt it was aimed squarely at me. I pulled out my phone, keeping it low in case anyone was watching, and searched for any news about strange disappearances or sightings of unmarked black vans in nearby towns. But there was nothing. It was like the whole thing had been scrubbed clean. No trace of anything I'd seen or heard. I was just about to give up when I found a single article buried on some obscure local blog, dated about a year back. It mentioned a handful of missing people from a town a few hours away. The writer claimed they'd seen black vans patrolling the area in the weeks leading up to the disappearances, and how the local police had completely dismissed any link. The article was vague, mostly speculation, but one line stood out, sending a chill down my spine. Sources claim that the people in the vans work for a shadow organization known only as Project Overseer. Their goal: collecting subjects for government experiments. And if you see them, don't get involved. Once you're on their radar, you're marked. I sat there staring at the screen, my mind reeling. Project Overseer. Subjects. It sounded like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. But after everything I'd seen, I couldn't brush it off as fiction. As I read over the article again, something caught my eye. Another van had just pulled into the parking lot outside the diner. I ducked low, peeking through the blinds, and my stomach dropped. It was the same van from my street, the one I'd seen parked across the road. I could make out the figure of a man in the driver's seat, just sitting there, staring straight at the diner. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. There was nowhere to run this time. I stayed low, heart pounding, as the van sat motionless outside the diner. My mind was racing, 1,000 panicked thoughts running through me. It felt like I'd run out of options. I couldn't call anyone without putting them in danger, and I couldn't just sit here, waiting for whatever Protocol X was to play out. After what felt like hours, the driver's side door of the van opened. A tall figure stepped out, dressed in black, from head to toe, moving slowly toward the diner entrance. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see enough. This was the same guy I'd seen the other night, dragging that woman from the van. I pressed myself down in the booth, feeling like I'd melt into the seat if I tried hard enough. I glanced around the diner. There were a couple of other late-night patrons, a trucker nursing a coffee, an old man dozing in his seat, and a waitress leaning against the counter. None of them had noticed the guy walking in. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. The front door swung open with a soft chime. The man paused, scanning the room, his eyes sweeping over the booths. I ducked further down, barely breathing. He started walking down the aisle, his footsteps heavy against the linoleum floor, each step sounding like a countdown to something awful. And then he stopped, right by my booth. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel him standing there, his presence pressing down on me like a weight. My pulse was so loud in my ears, I thought he'd be able to hear it. He just stood there, silent, like he was waiting for me to reveal myself. My fingers tightened around my phone, ready to bolt if he made a move. Suddenly, I heard the waitress's voice. "Can I help you, sir?" There was a pause, and then he turned, facing her. "Just looking for someone," he replied, his voice low, calm, and cold. I could feel him glance back at my booth, like he knew I was there, like he was just playing with me. But after a few more agonizing moments, he walked back toward the door and left the diner. I waited, every muscle tense, until I saw the van pull out of the parking lot and disappear into the night. Only then did I sit up, letting out a shaky breath. I felt like I'd been holding it forever, but I knew he'd be back. This wasn't over. I'd seen too much, and now I was marked. There was no way they'd just let me go. As I sat there, trying to figure out what to do next, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from another unknown number. My stomach twisted as I opened it, half expecting some threatening message. Instead, it was just a single line. "If you want to survive, get out of town. Now." I stared at it, trying to process what it meant. Was it a warning? A trap? Either way, I knew I didn't have many options left. I couldn't go back home, and I couldn't stay here. So, I made a decision. I was going to leave. Right now. No second guessing. No waiting around. I slipped out of the booth and headed for the door, throwing one last glance over my shoulder. The trucker and the old man were still there, blissfully unaware of what had just happened. Part of me felt like I should warn them, tell them to be careful, but I knew it was too late for that. This was my mess, and dragging anyone else into it would only make things worse. I made my way to the nearest bus station, checking over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see the van pull up behind me. But the streets were empty, silent, like the whole town was asleep. When I finally reached the station, I bought a one-way ticket to the next town over, hoping it would be enough to throw them off my trail, at least for a little while. The bus pulled up about an hour later, just as the first hints of dawn were starting to creep over the horizon. I boarded, slumping into a seat at the back, hoping that if I kept moving, maybe, just maybe, I'd be able to disappear. As the bus pulled out of town, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I was getting away, but I had no idea what I was running from. I kept checking my phone, expecting another message, some other cryptic warning or threat, but nothing came. Just the empty screen and the miles stretching out in front of me. I don't know how long I dozed off, but at some point, I woke up to the sound of someone clearing their throat. I looked up, and my blood turned to ice. A man was sitting a few rows ahead of me, his face partially turned, but I could tell who it was. The guy from the diner, the one who'd been in the black van. He must have sensed me staring, because he slowly turned his head, meeting my gaze with this chilling, unreadable look. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just kept looking at me, his eyes empty and cold. I realized, then and there, that there was no getting away. No matter where I went, how far I ran, they'd find me. The van, the chat room, the experiments, whatever I'd stumbled into, it was deeper than I could have ever imagined, and they weren't going to let me walk away from it. The man stood up, moving slowly toward me, each step deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. I wanted to scream, to tell the driver to stop the bus, but I was frozen, trapped in place by the look in his eyes. He stopped just beside me, leaned in, and whispered, "Protocol X has been activated. Welcome to Project Overseer." And then everything went black. I found a map on the dark web showing a hidden bunker near my house. The entrance wasn't empty. This all started about a month ago. I know. Every good horror story begins with someone doing something stupid. And yeah, I guess I fell right into that trap. I wasn't really trying to find anything creepy. I was just bored. It was one of those late nights where you're half awake, but too wired to sleep. That's when my friend Mike, a self-proclaimed internet guru, convinced me to try browsing the deep web. Not the horror movie stuff, but the deeper levels of the internet. Mike had this smug look, telling me all about the crazy things you could supposedly find, hidden like digital Easter eggs for the curious and the foolish. I mostly rolled my eyes, thinking he was just hyping it up for fun. But once he sent me a secure link to a forum called The Archive, I got a little more interested. I'm no hacker, but he assured me it was safe, so I clicked. Famous last words, right? The Archive was weird. It wasn't some horror show full of gore, nor was it just another list of conspiracy theories. It was more like a message board with random categories. Old maps, abandoned blueprints, satellite imagery, stuff that looked, at first glance, like pure conspiracy nonsense. But I'll admit, some of it was strange enough to be interesting. People were posting about tunnels, hidden rooms in old buildings, and abandoned bunkers. I kept scrolling, seeing stories that seemed to hover between realism and some kind of surreal game. Then, buried a few pages deep, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. Someone had posted an old grainy map of my town, but it had markings on it, red X's and dotted lines, places I didn't recognize. In the corner, written in tiny scratchy text, were the words, "Bunker number 27, secure." And here's the kicker. One of those red X's was practically in my backyard. Now, I don't live anywhere particularly interesting, just a typical suburban neighborhood with lots of open space and patches of forest around. I would have written it off as a joke if the location hadn't been so close to home. This map looked old, but the way it was detailed, I don't know. Something about it felt real. It wasn't a pirate treasure map with drawn-out landmarks. It looked more like a technical sketch, as if someone had meticulously studied the area. A weird thought popped into my head. I remembered the clearing out in the woods, a good 5 or 6 minutes walk behind my house. I'd been there 100 times, but never thought much of it. It was just an open spot, a place where kids would gather, mostly empty aside from the trees and an occasional deer. But according to this map, that clearing had something underneath it, something I'd never even imagined. So naturally, I did what any sane person would do. I saved the map. I kept going back to it, zooming in and out, trying to make sense of the markings. I figured it was just someone's prank, or maybe an old Cold War leftover. But the more I looked, the more real it felt. I even tried searching for bunker number 27 on Google, but got nothing. Not one result. It's as if it never existed. No records, no mentions, nothing. That only made me more curious. A week later, curiosity finally got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. I told myself it was just for fun, a little adventure to kill time. After all, what's the worst that could happen? I'd go to the clearing, look around, and laugh at myself for being a total idiot. But that night, as I lay in bed, the thought of that red X on the map lingered in my mind, twisting my excitement into a sense of unease. The next morning, I got up early, threw on some hiking clothes, and grabbed a flashlight. Not really sure why. I mean, I didn't expect to find anything, let alone need a flashlight. But there was a part of me, maybe the same part that kept staring at the map, that felt like I'd be digging deeper than I intended. I reached the clearing in under 10 minutes. It looked just like it always had. Empty, quiet, with that eerie kind of silence you only get in the early morning. But this time, I was looking for something specific. I followed the map as best as I could, lining myself up with trees and rocks that looked familiar, until I stood exactly where the red X should have been. Nothing, just grass, dirt, and a few fallen branches. I laughed, relieved and disappointed all at once. Of course, there was nothing there. But just as I turned to leave, I noticed something odd on the ground. It was a patch of dirt that seemed fresher than the rest, like someone had recently moved it. It didn't look like much, just a slightly darker, looser area of soil. I felt a weird jolt of excitement and dropped to my knees, brushing the dirt away with my hands. I'd like to say I was acting on some gut instinct, but honestly, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just a bored guy in the woods, hoping for a bit of mystery. As I brushed away more dirt, my fingers hit something hard and cold. It was metal. My hand shook a little as I cleared the dirt around it. The edges were rusted and rough, but as I pulled the rest of the soil away, a metal hatch came into view. It was circular, old, and covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. They looked almost like warning signs, but they were faded and scratched, as if they had been deliberately scraped off. That should have been enough for me. I should have left right then and there. But curiosity is a strange thing. It makes you feel invincible, like you're solving some grand mystery just waiting for you to uncover. And I was already too deep in to walk away. I found the latch and gave it a pull, but it wouldn't budge. It took a few tries, a lot of grunting and cursing, but eventually, with a horrible creaking sound, the hatch swung open. I half expected a wave of stale air to hit me, but there was nothing. Just an empty, silent darkness. I couldn't see more than a few feet down, but the metal rungs of a ladder led deep into the black void below. I shined my flashlight down, but the beam barely touched anything past the first few feet. And here's where I should have backed off. My heart was pounding. The silence around me felt heavier than it should have. But something kept pushing me, an itch in my mind that refused to go away. With one last look around the empty clearing, I gripped the ladder and began to climb down. The ladder creaked beneath my weight, each step echoing in the narrow space as I descended into the unknown. With every rung, I felt the world above me slip away, swallowed by the silence below. The dim glow from my flashlight was barely enough to cut through the thick darkness, and the air had this cold, stale feeling, like it hadn't moved in years. It was deeper than I'd expected. I kept glancing up to make sure the hatch was still open, the square of light from the surface shrinking as I went down. After what felt like forever, my foot finally hit solid ground. I took a few breaths, trying to shake off the feeling that I was standing in some kind of buried time capsule. My flashlight flickered, and I smacked it, cursing myself for not bringing new batteries. The beam steadied, casting pale light on the walls around me. The room was small, cramped, and concrete, barely more than a cube carved into the earth. It looked like some kind of makeshift entry point, or maybe a holding room. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, disappearing into the walls, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. There was nothing on the walls, no signs, no graffiti, nothing that would tell me what this place was or why it had been abandoned. Directly across from me was a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch further than the flashlight could reach. I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep going. It felt wrong, like I was trespassing somewhere no one was meant to find. But I told myself I'd come this far, and what harm could come from a quick look around. So I stepped into the hallway, the echo of my footsteps bouncing back at me in eerie, uneven intervals. The smell hit me halfway down the hall, a strange, metallic odor, sharp and faintly sour, like rust mixed with something rotten. I covered my nose, trying not to think about what could be causing it, and moved forward, slower this time. As I walked, I noticed strange patterns etched into the walls, almost like carvings. They were shallow, scratchy symbols that looked haphazard and frantic, like they'd been scraped in with something sharp. I traced one of them with my finger, feeling the rough, almost violent lines beneath my touch. It gave me chills, but I couldn't stop myself from trying to understand what they were. It almost looked like writing, but in no language I recognized. The hallway finally opened up into a larger room, and that's when things started to get weird. My flashlight flickered again, casting twisted shadows that made the room look like it was pulsing. At first, I thought the place was empty, just more of the same concrete walls, an eerie silence. But then I spotted something on the floor in the corner, a pile of what looked like crumpled, yellowed papers and old photographs. I knelt down, carefully picking up the top photo. It was black and white, blurry, with a faded date stamped in the corner, June 3rd, 1965. The picture showed a group of people standing in front of what looked like a metal door. Their faces were obscured by the glare, but their postures were rigid, almost unnatural, like they'd been posed that way. Behind them was a faded sign with a word barely legible: observation. I shuffled through more of the papers, trying to piece together what they meant. Most of the photos were similar. Groups of people in front of doors, stairwells, and underground rooms that looked a lot like the one I was in. Their faces were always blurred, smudged out or scratched over, as if someone didn't want them to be seen. And then I found something worse. At the bottom of the stack was a small handwritten note, smudged with dark stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, like someone had scrawled it out in a panic. Do not proceed without a mask. The subjects react to smell. Light triggers hostility. I stared at the note, trying to wrap my head around it. Subjects, hostility. What had I just walked into? I looked around, suddenly feeling the urge to leave. But then my flashlight caught something else in the corner. A door, heavy and slightly ajar. It was painted the same gray as the walls, nearly invisible in the dark. And just like the hallway behind me, it was covered in those strange, frantic scratches. My heart was pounding as I stood up and walked toward it, my flashlight beam growing weaker by the second. The door looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but as I got closer, I saw that there were fresh scratch marks on the metal, deep grooves that hadn't yet rusted over. It was as if something or someone had clawed at it, desperate to get out, or maybe to get in. I wanted to turn back. Every bone in my body screamed at me to climb that ladder, close the hatch, and forget this place ever existed. But something about the door, the scratches, the darkness behind it, made me feel like I was on the edge of uncovering something terrible, something hidden for a reason. With a shaky hand, I pushed the door open, and it groaned, the sound echoing like a scream down the corridor. The room beyond was pitch black, but it had a different kind of silence, one that felt thick and suffocating. I took a hesitant step inside, shining my flashlight around. There were rows of benches, old and rusted, bolted to the floor like seats in a waiting room. The walls were lined with strange devices, machines with dials and levers, tubes and wires that led into the walls and disappeared. At the far end was another door, larger and reinforced with heavy metal bars across it. Above it, someone had painted a crude warning in red paint. Unsafe for entry without authorization. Proceed with caution. But the thing that made my skin crawl was what was lying next to the door. At first, I thought it was a pile of rags, maybe an old uniform that had been abandoned. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't clothes at all. It was a mask, an old cracked gas mask with the filters rusted and caked in dirt. It looked like it had been placed there intentionally, almost like an offering, or maybe a final warning. I reached down to pick it up, the mask's weight oddly heavy in my hand, as if someone had held onto it tightly for a long time. My fingers brushed against the filters, and I noticed a small tag stitched into the inside, barely visible under layers of grime. It read, simply, Number 27 - Subject Protection Gear. Subject Protection, I whispered, the words lingering in the cold air. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to wear it, but the note from earlier echoed in my mind. Do not proceed without a mask. I slipped it on, the rubber cold and unforgiving against my skin, the lenses clouded from years of neglect. I took a few steadying breaths, my breathing loud and echoing inside the mask, and as I adjusted the straps, a distant sound reached my ears, faint but unmistakable, a soft scraping sound, like metal against metal, coming from the far side of the heavy door, and then a whisper, too low to make out, but undeniably human. Frozen in place, I watched as the door at the far end began to tremble, dust falling from the hinges as something on the other side pushed against it, scratching, scraping, testing the lock. My flashlight flickered, the battery dying, plunging me into darkness with only the faint, distorted breath inside my mask to keep me company. I held my breath, staring into the void as the scraping grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right on the other side of the door. Then, with one last, echoing scratch, the sound stopped. But just as the silence settled, I heard a single, muffled word, as if spoken right next to my ear. "Welcome." My heart was hammering so loud I could barely hear myself breathe through the mask. That single word, "welcome," hung in the stale air around me, twisting into an invitation I wasn't sure I wanted. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to climb that ladder and never look back. But there was something about the door, the scratches, that whisper, that held me in place, as if I'd stumbled onto something that wouldn't let me go until I understood it. The flashlight flickered back to life, its pale light barely illuminating the path back to the hallway. I shone it towards the far door, my hand shaking. For a second, I swore I saw movement, a shadow, something shifting just behind the thick, reinforced door. I wasn't alone down here. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut, but somehow the fear made me sharper, more alert. I took a step closer, the weight of the gas mask on my face, a strange comfort, a reminder of the note's warning. If there really was something here, maybe the mask would protect me. Maybe it would keep me hidden, keep me safe. With my flashlight steady, I examined the room more closely. There were more objects scattered around the floor, things that, at first glance, seemed like junk, but on closer inspection had that eerie, left in a hurry feel to them. A small, broken notebook lay near the rusted benches, its cover half torn off and stained with some dark, oily substance. I picked it up, wiping the grime off the pages, and squinted to make out the shaky handwriting. Most of it was too faded to read, but a few lines were still legible. Date, June 12th, 1965. Subject interactions intensifying. Protocol advises. The next few words were illegible, but further down, another line stood out. They respond to unfamiliar scents. Masks advised. Flipping the page, I found a sketch of the room I was standing in, with the heavy door marked as containment. There were notes scribbled around it, words like scratching, agitated states, and the one that sent a chill down my spine. No one should speak directly. I dropped the notebook, my hands trembling. Whoever had been down here, they were documenting something. Something contained behind that door. Something that should never have been disturbed. And now, here I was, alone with it. I couldn't help but wonder if anyone had ever made it back up that ladder, or if they'd all ended up as forgotten whispers in the dark. That was when I noticed the noise. Soft, barely audible at first, but growing louder by the second. A low, rhythmic sound, like distant breathing. The air felt heavier, almost alive, and each breath seemed to resonate through the concrete walls. I held my own breath, terrified of making even the smallest sound. And then, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment, the heavy door at the far end creaked open, just a sliver, but enough to see the pitch-black darkness beyond it. My flashlight's beam trembled as I aimed it toward the crack, my hands clammy inside the mask. Nothing, just shadows, silent and unmoving. But that breathing sound, it was closer now, deep and hollow, and each exhale seemed to carry a faint whisper, something unintelligible, yet unmistakably human. I couldn't see anything, but the weight of its presence felt suffocating. as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching me, waiting. I stepped back, keeping the flashlight aimed at the door, but every instinct told me that something was lurking in the dark, watching my every move. The mask felt tighter on my face, each breath coming quicker, louder. I forced myself to calm down, to take slow, steady breaths, but the silence was broken again by a faint, echoing voice from beyond the door. "Help me." It was soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakably there. I froze, a surge of dread washing over me. It didn't sound like a cry for help. It sounded hollow, like someone reciting words they didn't fully understand. The kind of tone you'd expect from someone who hadn't spoken in a very, very long time. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears, and nearly tripped over something lying on the floor. A small metal object that clinked as it hit the ground. I shone my flashlight on it. A tiny, rusted key. It didn't look like much, but I had a sinking feeling it was meant for that door. Whoever had dropped it must have been down here before me. Maybe one of the people in those eerie photos. Maybe the one who'd left the mask and notebook. And now, they weren't here. The voice from behind the door grew more insistent, each plea warping into something harsher, angrier. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, the air thick and charged with a kind of static energy. My instincts told me to leave, but something else, the same gnawing curiosity that had brought me here in the first place, compelled me to stay. I held the key, my fingers slick with sweat, and slowly I stepped toward the door, the whispers growing louder with each step. They morphed from pleas into something darker, a low, rasping chant that filled the space around me. It was like the voices were seeping through the concrete itself, clawing their way into my ears. Then, as I reached the door, the chanting stopped. Silence returned, thick and absolute. I could hear my own breathing, amplified within the mask. Each exhale a reminder that I was utterly alone. But then, I heard it again. A single, breathy whisper, right on the other side of the door. So close, I could feel the cold chill of it through the mask. "We've been waiting." I dropped the key. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, to climb back up that ladder and never look back. But as I turned, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my flashlight's dying beam, a pale, shadowy outline pressed against the door from the other side. I didn't see details, just a shape, something tall and thin, fingers clawing around the door's edge as if reaching for me. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor, its beam now flickering weakly across the room. I scrambled to pick it up, the mask's narrow lenses clouding as my breath grew faster, shallower. The shadow shifted, and I heard a slow, scratching sound, like nails dragging against metal. Without thinking, I bolted. I sprinted down the hall, barely able to see, the mask fogging up as I gasped for air. Behind me, I could still hear the scratching, faint but persistent, like something was scraping along the walls, following me, creeping ever closer. I reached the ladder and climbed as fast as I could, hands shaking, feet slipping on the rungs as I scrambled upward. The hatch above was a mere pinprick of light now, and as I climbed, I heard the scraping sound echoing below, louder, faster, closing in. When I finally reached the top, I shoved the hatch open and threw myself onto the ground, gulping in fresh air as I scrambled to shut it. My hands fumbled for a rock, anything to weigh it down, to keep whatever was down there from following me. I grabbed a large stone and shoved it onto the hatch, my heart racing as I backed away, my eyes never leaving that dark spot in the ground. For a moment, there was silence. The forest around me felt unnaturally still, like the world itself was holding its breath. And then, just as I thought I was safe, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic scratching from beneath the hatch, slow and deliberate, as if something down there knew I was still listening. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as I watched the hatch, praying it would stay closed. But the scratching never stopped. It was as if that thing, whatever it was waiting, patient and persistent, knowing that I'd return one day. As I staggered back toward my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, that maybe, just maybe, I'd opened something that couldn't be shut. And every night since, I've heard faint scratches coming from the woods, growing louder, closer, as if it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. I barely remember stumbling back to my house, my mind clouded with a bone-deep dread that settled like ice in my veins. I locked the door behind me, triple-checking every window and door, the flashlight still clutched in my hand like a lifeline. My lungs felt raw, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. All I could think about was the scratching, the way it had followed me up the ladder, the way it had scraped against the hatch, as if promising that it wasn't over. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out the window toward the tree line where the bunker was hidden, expecting to see something, anything, moving in the dark. Every tiny noise in the house, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, made me jump. By the time dawn broke, I felt like a shadow of myself, hollowed out and haunted. But what really got to me was the silence. My neighborhood is usually full of noise, dogs barking, kids yelling, cars passing by. But that morning, it was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to creep through the walls. I figured I was just jumpy, that I'd spooked myself, and I tried to shake it off. I told myself I'd forget about the bunker, go back to normal life, pretend it had all been a nightmare. But then the noises started. It was the third night after I'd been in the bunker. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the paranoia gnawing at me, when I heard it. A faint, familiar scratching sound, coming from somewhere in the walls. My breath hitched. At first, I thought it was a mouse, or maybe a branch scraping against the side of the house. But the noise was steady, rhythmic, the same pattern I'd heard in the bunker. A long, slow scrape, then a pause, and another scrape. It was so precise, so deliberate, that it couldn't be anything natural. I stayed frozen in bed, listening, every muscle in my body tense. The scratching grew louder, moving along the wall, inching closer to my room. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, like something was crawling through the dark spaces between the studs, feeling its way toward me. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of bed, my heart pounding as I moved toward the source of the sound. I followed it down the hallway, each step echoing in the quiet house. The scratching seemed to shift, moving from one wall to another, always just out of reach, always one step ahead. It led me down to the basement door, the sound growing louder, sharper, as if whatever was making it was aware of my presence. The basement was the one place I hadn't checked, the one place I always avoided. But now, it seemed like the scratching was coming from right beneath my feet, urging me to go down. Against every instinct, I opened the door and flipped the light switch. The old bulbs flickered on, casting long shadows over the cluttered boxes and storage bins below. I took a deep breath and descended, the wooden steps creaking beneath me. The scratching continued, muffled now, but still audible, coming from the far corner of the basement where an old, rusted metal cabinet sat against the wall. I hadn't touched that cabinet in years. It was full of useless junk, broken tools, old magazines, things I'd meant to throw out but never got around to. The scratching grew louder as I approached the cabinet, and for a second I hesitated. I was terrified of what I might find, of what might be lurking behind that rusted door. But something deeper than fear pushed me forward. I had to know. I pulled open the cabinet door, half expecting to find some animal trapped inside. But there was nothing, just empty shelves covered in dust. The scratching had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I leaned in, confused, my mind racing with explanations, when I noticed something etched into the back panel of the cabinet. Faint, almost hidden beneath the dust, were the same scratchy symbols I'd seen in the bunker. They covered the entire back panel, looping and twisting in chaotic patterns that made my head spin just looking at them. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again, the whisper. Help. Me. It was so close, as if someone was standing right behind me, their breath brushing against my neck. I spun around, but the basement was empty. The whisper was gone, replaced by the oppressive silence that filled every corner of the room. I stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me and locking it. My skin crawled, and I felt like I was being watched, like something had followed me up those stairs and was standing just on the other side of the door, waiting. Over the next few nights, the scratching grew more frequent, more insistent. It would start in the walls, then move to the ceiling, sometimes even the floorboards beneath my bed. I began to feel trapped in my own home, like no matter where I went, that sound would follow, creeping closer with each passing hour. I tried to drown it out with music, with TV, but nothing worked. The scratching would seep through, filling the silence like a heartbeat, relentless and unyielding. I couldn't escape it, couldn't sleep, couldn't even think straight. Then one night, I heard something new. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed, wide awake, when a faint tapping sound started coming from my bedroom window. I froze, barely daring to breathe, listening as the tapping grew louder, more urgent. It sounded like someone, or something, was outside, tapping on the glass with their fingertips. I forced myself to look, my heart racing as I turned my head toward the window. The blinds were drawn, but I could see a faint silhouette standing just outside, its outline barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight. It was tall, thin, with arms that seemed too long, fingers that ended in thin, sharp points. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, each tap echoing like a clock counting down. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. I waited, hardly daring to move, but the figure didn't leave. It just stood there, unmoving, watching me from the other side of the glass. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to turn on the lights, to grab my phone and call someone, anyone. But I was paralyzed, trapped in some nightmare where even the smallest movement might draw it closer. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity, until the figure finally shifted. I held my breath, watching as it leaned closer to the window, its face now inches from the glass. I couldn't see its features, only the dark, hollow outline of its eyes staring straight at me. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, it spoke. "You brought us back." The words sent a chill through me, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stared with those empty eyes, as if waiting for me to answer. But I couldn't. I was too terrified, too numb to even think. Eventually, the figure turned, slowly fading back into the shadows, disappearing into the night. But the words it left behind lingered in my mind, a sinister echo that wouldn't go away. Since that night, the scratching has stopped, but something else has taken its place. Shadows move in the corners of my vision, strange shapes and figures that vanish the moment I try to focus on them. My house feels different, like it's been tainted, corrupted by whatever I brought back from that bunker. And every night, just before I fall asleep, I hear a faint, whispering voice in the darkness, reminding me of my mistake. "You brought us back." I tried everything to get my life back to normal. I ignored the sounds, avoided the basement, and even tried staying away from the house for a few nights. But the shadows, the whispers, they clung to me, following me no matter where I went. It was like the bunker had left some kind of invisible stain, a haunting that I couldn't escape. Each night brought me closer to some dark, inevitable end, and I could feel it tightening around me, like a noose. One night, I woke up to the sensation of being watched. My room was thick with silence, but I could feel it, an oppressive presence that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I lay there, paralyzed, knowing that whatever had been following me since the bunker was now here, in my room. I could feel its weight in the air, heavy and unyielding, a blackness so deep that it seemed to swallow the room whole. My instincts told me not to open my eyes, to keep pretending to be asleep. But curiosity, or maybe some darker part of myself, made me crack one eye open, just enough to catch a glimpse of what was standing at the foot of my bed. It was the figure from the window, but clearer this time. Its body was tall and impossibly thin, like it had been stretched beyond human limits. The arms hung low, almost to its knees, ending in those long, thin fingers that had tapped on my window. Its face was wrong, smooth and featureless, with nothing but a faint, dark impression where its eyes should have been, like empty sockets staring straight at me. For what felt like an eternity, we just stayed there, me lying frozen in bed, and it standing, silent and still, watching. And then slowly, it began to reach out, one of its hands extending toward me, the fingers unfurled like spider legs, inching closer, closer, until I could feel the cold air radiating from them. Just as the tips of its fingers brushed my arm, I snapped. I leapt from the bed, scrambling for the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I stumbled down the hallway, barely able to see through the darkness, my only goal to get out of the house. I reached the front door, fumbled with the lock, and burst outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I looked back at the house, expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, watching me, but it wasn't there. The house sat silent, dark, as if nothing had happened. I waited, shivering in the cold, watching the windows for any sign of movement, but the house stayed still, indifferent. After a few minutes, I forced myself to go back. I couldn't stay out there all night, and some desperate part of me clung to the hope that maybe it was over. Maybe that was it, some kind of final warning. But as I walked up the driveway, something caught my eye. The basement light was on. I know I hadn't turned it on. I hadn't been down there in days, not since I'd heard the scratching. The sight of that light filled me with a dread so intense I could hardly breathe. But I knew, deep down, that I had to face it. I had to go down there, confront whatever was waiting. The house was silent as I stepped inside, each creak of the floorboards echoing in the dark. I walked to the basement door, gripping the handle, feeling the icy chill seep into my palm. With one last, steadying breath, I opened it and started down the stairs. The light was dim, flickering, casting strange shadows that twisted and stretched across the walls. At the bottom of the steps, the scratching had returned, soft, barely there, but unmistakable. It was coming from the far corner, from that old rusted cabinet, the same cabinet where I'd found the symbols, where I'd heard the first whisper. But this time, the cabinet was open. Inside, where the empty shelves had been, there was now a small, dark hole, barely large enough for me to squeeze through. It looked freshly dug, the edges raw and uneven, as if someone or something had clawed its way out. And then I heard it again, the whisper, so close it felt like it was inside my head. "You brought us back. You must finish it." I backed away, my mind racing, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I could feel something cold brushing against my skin, as if invisible hands were reaching out, pulling me toward the hole. I fought against it, scrambling up the stairs, the whispers growing louder, angrier, but the house itself seemed to shift around me, the walls pressing in, the floor tilting beneath my feet. The whispers became a roar, a cacophony of voices, each one chanting the same words over and over. "Finish it, finish it, finish it." I stumbled into the living room, the walls vibrating with the force of the voices. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I was left standing there, trembling, the house dark and still once more. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally looked around, I saw something lying on the floor by the door. A key, rusted, old, with a small tag attached to it. My heart sank as I picked it up, dread pooling in my stomach. The tag read simply, "Number 27. I understood then that this wasn't over. The bunker, the whispers, the figure, they wouldn't leave me alone until I went back. I disturbed something, and it had followed me home, like a shadow I couldn't shake. So here I am now, writing this as I sit in my car outside the clearing, the key heavy in my pocket. I don't know what's going to happen when I go back down there. Maybe this time I won't come back up, but whatever's waiting for me down there, it's not going to let me go until I finish it. If you find this, if you're reading this, take my advice. Don't go digging into things that should stay buried. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, and some places don't want to be found. I'm going back now.